Traveling by airplane, they say, is safer than traveling by car. Statistically, that's true. The per mile risk for vehicle transportation is 750 times higher than the per mile risk of traveling by air. So the evidence is clear. Air travel is safer, right? However, if you've been watching the news recently, there's this story that's been just kind of ubiquitous on the radio, TV, social media, newspapers about the door plug incident on the 737 MAX 9. And it seems like the whole thing comes into question. Now, I'm not bringing this up this morning to bash Boeing or to scare you away from airplane travel, but it underlines a point that travel can be dangerous. Any kind of travel can be dangerous. It's always been like that. But it's a part of life. Journeys are a part of life. They are now, and they were back in the days when this psalm, Psalm 121, was written. In fact, life is a journey of sorts, and therefore we could surmise that life is also dangerous. Someone once said that life is dangerous and no one will get out of it alive. On a human level, that's true. But what's the answer to that? Should we just cower in fear all the time, or is there another answer? This psalm is a prayer for the journey of life. So I'd like to begin this morning by just asking, what is dangerous about your journey? Do you live with health issues that endanger your life? Are you on the edge financially? That can feel dangerous. Do you live in fear that something from your past will reoccur, or it'll show up and cause you trouble? I have a feeling that all of us, if we think about it long enough, could come up with some danger just related to being a pilgrim on the earth. You may be aware that these Psalms, Psalm 120 all the way to Psalm 134, they all have the same subtitle if you look at them. Did you notice it? It says a psalm of ascent. These are the ascension psalms. They're prayers that were designed specifically for pilgrims as they made their way up to the holy city of Jerusalem. Pilgrimage was and continues to be a really big deal for religious people. And it wasn't necessarily a very safe thing to do, to travel on the roads leading up to Jerusalem. So it helped to be reminded that God was with them. And Psalm 121 is the best known of the Ascension Psalms. Do I sound a little bit loud to you? Can you turn me down a little bit, Blair? That way, if I raise my voice, if I really get into it, then everybody won't be going, ah! So Psalm 121 is the best known of these Ascension Psalms, and it's often quoted even in the Apostles' Creed. Did you know that? I believe in one God, the Father of Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. There's a quote from Psalm 121. So this psalm has been memorized by many people. I mentioned it to Wasim. Where's Wasim? Yeah, no, I mentioned it. Yeah, Jamil's here, but where's Wasim? Wasim, are you back here? I mentioned it to Wasim a couple of weeks ago, and you started singing the Zabur, Psalm 121. You love that. A lot of people have memorized Psalm 121. It's really second only to Psalm 23 in its popularity and in its meaning. I think of Psalm 121 as the mountain view psalm. If you read it in some translations, Chris is just reading to me the message. How does it begin, Chris, the message, Psalm 121?
I look to the mountains. My strength come from mountains?
No, my strength does not come from mountains. My help comes from the God who made the mountains. I love that. I look to the mountains. I mentioned last Sunday that I was installed as pastor here on February 4th, 1996, 28 years ago, last Sunday, or 2 Sundays ago. But that was not my first Sunday preaching in this church. There's another Sunday, actually, with the first time you come to a church when you're a new pastor, is called Candidating Sunday. So you preach a sermon and then they vote. And, do we want this guy or not? So the congregation votes. Not unlike how we're going to vote at our financial meeting after this service. You all get to vote, if you're members of this church, on the pastor's terms of call, the salary of your pastors. It's brought up for a vote every year. Well, on that Sunday, I preached a sermon, my candidating sermon, and then there was a vote after that. And the passage that I chose for that Sunday was this one, Psalm 121. And to me, it was like a no-brainer. I mean, what passage would you preach your first Sunday at Mountain View Presbyterian Church? Well, it has to be Psalm 121. I look to the mountains. I'm mountain viewing, so that made sense to me. You probably know that Pastor Dan is responsible for the sermon series planning. We're doing the series on the Psalms right now, Rooted, and he's planning the Sundays and what Psalms we're doing. I'm really, really thankful that Dan graciously allowed me to have Psalm 121 today, because it really carries special meaning and memories for me. In his book on the Psalms, my favorite Christian author suggests that the Psalms are a special kind of speech. He calls it answering speech. Eugene Peterson's book on Psalms 1 through 5 is entitled Answering God, because he says God always speaks first, and anything we say is, of course, an answer to what he has said. And he also suggests that answering is appropriate when one is prompted by a question, right? Have you ever spent a significant amount of time with a 3-year-old? If you have, then you know the most challenging question of all is, exactly, why? Well, this Psalm 121 answers a very basic question about you and me and God. Why trust God? You have other options than following God, submitting to God. So, why would you? In Psalm 121, we find some great reasons to submit, trust, and follow God. And it begins its answer to the question by getting us in touch with real life. Real life, as we've said, where airplanes crash and cars collide, a life full of danger, perils of illness, and evil people who will not hesitate to hurt you to get what they want. So, in looking at this real life, Psalm 121 lists 3 types of peril, 3 types of danger. And the first is the unknown evils of not being safe at home. You could just stay home all the time. There is safety in just staying in your house. And there's peril inherent in any time you choose to walk out your door and leave home. Verse 1 talks about, as we've said, looking up to the hills. having traveled the roads leading up to Jerusalem, I can tell you that if you choose to leave home and go to Jerusalem, there are jagged, rocky hills all around that you have to go through to get to Jerusalem. The roads are windy and treacherous. And even in the days before automobile travel, those winding, steep roads were often fraught with bandits looking for a weak group from whom they could steal. Large groups would often send people ahead, sentries, to place in the hills to warn them of these evil people. So the psalmist looks up at those hills and asks, where does my help come from? Who's my protection from those who wish to do me harm? Does my help come from the hills? And immediately comes the affirmation, the Lord is my helper. The Lord who made the hills, the Lord who made the mountains and the heavens is my helper. Sometimes the scariest part of the journey is nighttime. On a trip to Jerusalem, sleeping alongside the road could be more than a little unnerving. It helped the pilgrims to know that God does not sleep. So when they slept by the road, exposed to who knows what, God was watching them. Do you find it hard to sleep when you're away from home? Sleeping on a journey can be a challenge. Some of my best childhood experiences were when we were traveling by boat. I was talking to Blair this morning about sailing and boat travel, and I have this distinct memory of waking up in the morning when the engines of the boat started. We had a boat that had big diesel engines on it, and you couldn't stay asleep when the engines started because they were really loud, and they were right near the place where I was asleep. But it was often early in the morning, like an hour before sunrise, when we'd start out, and I'd hear the engine start, and I'd hear the rustle of feet on the deck as the lines are being gathered in, and I knew that we were beginning a long day of cruising. And I can distinctly remember falling back asleep, knowing that my father was at the helm. He was ever vigilant. There's never a chance that he'd fall asleep or be careless with our lives. We had total confidence in my dad's abilities to watch out for us in this way. He never fell asleep at the wheel. We could sleep, we could play games, we could clean the galley, we could swab the decks, all without worry, because my dad was at the wheel. He was in charge, at the helm. This is what the psalmist is suggesting about the Lord. He never slumbers. He never sleeps. God is ever vigilant. So on the journey, the perils that come from just being away from home, a pilgrim living life, it's part of the territory. God never misses a thing. He is your helper. He's your vigilant keeper. So the second peril the psalmist refers to is actually in two parts: the moon and the sun. Verse 6. This is literally the sun by day and the moon by night. Or in other words, you could say sunstroke and moonstroke. Sunstroke. You can let this represent the kinds of things that can assault your body as the sun would if you stayed in it too long. Those of us who have traveled to Africa in the summertime have learned that you just don't mess with that. You never stay out in the sun in the afternoon because it can hurt you quickly. The psalmist is talking about illness and the danger of being in a hostile environment, living in a fragile human body. God cares for you in these things. He does not wish for you to suffer. Sunstroke, the things that could happen to your body. Moonstroke, let this represent the kinds of things that can assault your mind and your emotions. In the ancient world, it was thought that being exposed to moonlight for too long would make you sick in your mind. This is where we get the word lunacy, related to lunar exposure. And while we no longer think of it this way, the truth about God doesn't change. God cares for you in these things, that you have a healthy mind and emotions. God does not wish for you to suffer. The psalmist is saying that God shades us from the sun by day and the moon by night. This is similar to another psalm that speaks of God keeping us under the shadow of his wings. You know that one? This is perhaps a reference to the wings of angels or the winged creatures that were portrayed by the carvings on the Ark of the Covenant. You've seen pictures of the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, representing God's covering, shading, protection over God's people. Now, notice the psalmist does not say that you will never suffer. Shade is not the same thing as air conditioning. He does say that the Lord is your keeper, your shade, present with you, whatever happens. So the third peril you find in verse 7, that the Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. This is an extraordinarily complete, overarching statement. And then it's even expanded to also include your going out and your coming in. Wherever you are, and from this time forth and forever, whenever. This is saying anywhere, anytime, everywhere, every time, God is keeping watch over you so that no evil can overtake you. Remember the question, why submit to God? Here's a psalm that says, there is no situation in which the follower of Christ will be beyond God's keeping. So, why submit to God's plan for your life? It's coming clearer. It has something to do with allowing God to be in control. It has something to do with letting go of that control and letting God be in charge. I've taught 3 people how to drive cars. It was very interesting. Samson knows what I'm talking about. Samson, I think he's probably taught somewhere between 50 and 100 people to drive cars. Most people, when they come here from Pakistan, don't have driver's licenses. So the driving teacher for many of them has been Samson. I know Don Cunningham has been involved at times, and also Amanda has helped out with this too. But when it comes to teaching people how to drive cars, Samson's a pro. I remember when our kids were learning how, my wife, Chris, she bowed out really early in the driving instruction game with Becca. She found it too unnerving. There was an incident involving a stop sign that ended up on the ground. And that stop sign actually started out the normal height like most stop signs. It was the one over by Bartell's, over by the YMCA. And then for like 10 years, it was like waist height. And we all knew why. So, have you ridden in a car with a brand new driver? Somebody who's just learning? Contrast that with riding with someone who's a professional, like Samson, who spent years teaching others how to drive. You're with a brand new driver contrasted with somebody who's really good at it and confident. Life is a car ride. God's at the wheel. He's no beginner. Where are you sitting? Are you in the front seat ready to grab the wheel? Or are you in the back seat, ready for whatever comes along, enjoying the trip, ready to get out the next stop and do whatever he says? Who's in control of your life? Last week, I talked about the importance of having a relationship with Jesus. Well, here's the next step of being rooted in your faith. Not only a relationship with Jesus, but a trusting relationship. Is this you? Let's pray.